The sun blazed over the golden sands of ancient Egypt. Along the great Nile River, massive temples reached toward the sky. He was not just any king. He was a ruler who would change the ancient world forever. For 66 long years, from 1279 to 1213 before the birth of Christ, Ramesses commanded an empire that stretched from the heart of Africa to the edges of Asia. No pharaoh before him had ruled for so long. No pharaoh after him would match his fame. It's what he did with the power that the gods had given him. The mighty Nile River flowed through the center of the kingdom, bringing life to the desert. There were temples dedicated to the gods, palaces where the royal family lived, and markets where merchants sold goods from around the world. Egyptian soldiers carried the finest weapons and rode in fast war chariots. They knew how to fight in the desert heat and how to attack enemy cities. When the pharaoh wanted to expand his empire, his armies would march out and conquer new lands. Egypt had many enemies who wanted to destroy the kingdom and take its wealth for themselves. To the north, the powerful Hittite Empire was always ready for war. There were no cars or airplanes, no telephones or computers. They built pyramids and temples using mathematics and engineering that still amazes us today. They developed one of the first systems of writing. They created beautiful art and jewelry. They understood astronomy and could predict when the Nile would flood each year. Messages had to be carried by messengers on foot or on horseback. It could take months to send a letter from Egypt to distant parts of the empire. Through wars and peace treaties, through magnificent buildings and clever politics, through sheer force of will and brilliant leadership, he would become exactly what he dreamed of being. He would become the greatest pharaoh who ever lived, a man whose story still captures our imagination more than 3,000 years after his death. He was tall and strong, with the confidence of a man born to command. Ancient descriptions tell us he had piercing eyes and a powerful voice that could be heard across a battlefield. When he entered a room, everyone knew immediately that they were in the presence of royalty. Wars were fought with swords, spears, and bows and arrows. Doctors had no modern medicines to cure diseases. To the south, the kingdoms of Nubia sometimes rebelled against Egyptian rule, not just in the afterlife, which all Egyptians believed in, but in the memory of future generations. He wanted people thousands of years in the future to know his name and remember his deeds. To the east and west, desert tribes would attack Egyptian settlements whenever they thought they could get away with it. The capital city was a wonder to see. Foreign visitors would stand amazed at the wealth and beauty they found there. He did not just want to maintain the empire his father had left him. He wanted to make it greater than it had ever been before. He dreamed of monuments so magnificent that people would travel from the ends of the earth to see them. He imagined victories so complete that enemy kingdoms would surrender just at the mention of his name. He had learned to ride war chariots, shoot arrows with deadly accuracy, and command soldiers in battle. More importantly, he had learned to think like a king. He understood that being pharaoh meant making decisions that would affect millions of people. The Egyptian people believed he was a god walking on earth. He was not just ruling over one country. He was the guardian of an empire that included parts of what we now call Sudan, Libya, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. Millions of people looked to him for protection, justice, and leadership. They thought he was the son of Ra, the sun god, and that he had divine power to rule over all people. This was not just something they said to make the king feel good. The people truly believed it with all their hearts. Every year, the river would flood and leave rich black soil on the land. This soil grew the grain that fed millions of people. It made Egypt the richest country in the ancient world. While other pharaohs were content to rule Egypt alone, Ramesses dreamed of something much bigger. He wanted to build an empire that would never be forgotten, wanted his name to echo through time itself. Enormous statues of kings looked out across the water with stone eyes that seemed alive. This was the land of the pharaohs, the most powerful rulers the world had ever known. And among all these mighty kings, one name stands above all others. His name was Ramesses II. But history remembers him as Ramesses the Great. Over 3,000 years ago, when Egypt ruled much of the known world, this incredible man sat on the throne of the pharaohs. In those days, Egypt was the greatest power on earth. Other kingdoms trembled at the mention of its name. Traders came from distant lands to buy Egyptian gold and precious goods. Armies marched under Egyptian banners across deserts and mountains. From his very first breath, everyone knew this child was special. The priests said the gods had blessed him. The generals said he would be a great warrior. The builders said he would create monuments that would last forever. They were all right. And at the center of all this power sat one man on a golden throne, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Ramesses was born to rule. His father was already Pharaoh when the boy came into the world around 1303 before Christ. But what made Ramesses truly great was not just his birth or his royal blood. The Egypt that Ramesses ruled was a land of incredible wealth and beauty. Along the banks of the Nile stood cities filled with magnificent buildings. But Egypt was not just about riches and beautiful buildings. It was also about power. The Egyptian army was the strongest in the world. The pharaoh himself was considered more than just a king. When Ramesses became pharaoh at the age of 24, he understood the enormous responsibility that came with his crown. The young pharaoh also knew that the ancient world was a dangerous place. But Ramesses was not afraid of these challenges. From childhood, he had been trained to be a warrior and a leader. The world that Ramesses lived in was very different from our world today. Yet in many ways, the people of ancient Egypt were remarkably advanced. Into this world of wonder and danger stepped Ramesses the Great. But what truly set Ramesses apart from other pharaohs was his vision. Most importantly, Ramesses wanted to achieve something that no pharaoh had ever accomplished before. He wanted to make himself immortal. As impossible as this dream seemed, Ramesses the Great would make it come true. The royal palace in ancient Egypt was not a quiet place for children. While ordinary boys played simple games in the streets, the future Ramesses the Great grew up surrounded by the sounds of war and politics. Born around 1303 before Christ, he entered a world where being a prince meant preparing for the most important job on earth, ruling the greatest empire in the ancient world. This meant the boy was born into incredible wealth and power, but it also meant he would never have a normal childhood. From the moment he could walk and talk, everyone around him knew he would one day wear the double crown of Egypt. Every lesson he learned, every game he played, and every person he met was chosen to prepare him for that future. His father, Seti I, was already pharaoh when little Ramesses took his first breath. A pharaoh had to understand religion because he was considered a living god. He had to know about building and engineering because great monuments brought glory to Egypt. He decided that his son would not just learn about war from books and teachers. The boy would experience real military life. At the amazing age of 10 years old, Ramesses received his first official title, Captain of the Army, Seti I. Truly expected his son to learn how to be a soldier. The boy had to wake up early with the other officers. He had to practice using weapons until his arms ached. He had to learn how to ride war chariots at high speed across rough ground. He had to understand how armies moved and fought. He had to study the stars and seasons because the flooding of the Nile River was crucial for growing food. Most importantly, he had to master the art of war. The palace where Ramesses grew up was like a small city. Hundreds of people lived and worked there. There were servants who brought food and cleaned rooms. Instead of just training with the army, he would join real military campaigns. This meant traveling to distant parts of the empire, where Egyptian soldiers were fighting actual battles against real enemies. This knowledge would prove incredibly valuable later when he became pharaoh and had to deal with foreign rulers and diplomats. But they quickly learned that Ramesses was no ordinary child. He was strong for his age and incredibly brave. His education continued in many other areas as well. Palace priests taught him about the complex religious beliefs of ancient Egypt. They explained how the pharaoh was connected to the gods and what ceremonies he would need to perform to keep the gods happy. They showed him the sacred texts and taught him the prayers that only pharaohs were allowed to know. When older boys might have cried or complained about the hard training, young Ramesses pushed himself to do better. He seemed to have no fear of horses, weapons, or dangerous exercises. Ra was the sun god and the most important deity. Osiris ruled over the dead in the afterlife. Isis was a goddess of magic and healing. He was taller and stronger than most people his age. His voice carried authority even when he was giving simple commands. He had learned from the best teachers, trained with the finest soldiers, and traveled to distant parts of the empire. He had seen battle and bloodshed, but also art and beauty. He understood both the power and the responsibility that came with being pharaoh. When he entered a room, people naturally turned to look at him. He had the presence that great leaders need to inspire others to follow them. At 24 years old, he was ready to become pharaoh of the greatest empire on earth. Horus was the god of kingship, and every pharaoh was considered to be Horus in human form. Egypt was famous throughout the ancient world for its incredible monuments. The pyramids, temples, and statues built by earlier pharaohs amazed foreign visitors and showed everyone how powerful and advanced Egyptian civilization was. Ramesses learned how these great projects were planned and constructed, studied mathematics and engineering so he could one day create his own magnificent buildings. Young Ramesses had to memorize all their stories and understand how to honor each one properly. His tutors taught him that ruling an empire was like conducting a giant orchestra. Every person in the kingdom had a role to play, from the highest noble to the simplest farmer. The pharaoh's job was to make sure everyone worked together in harmony. This required understanding people, making fair decisions, and knowing when to be firm and when to be merciful. There were guards who protected the royal family. There were priests who performed religious ceremonies. He saw how soldiers acted when they were afraid. He learned which officers could be trusted in dangerous situations and which ones might run away when things got difficult. He discovered that winning battles required more than just having better weapons. It required understanding the minds of both friends and enemies. There were scribes who wrote down important messages and laws, and there were teachers whose only job was to educate the young prince. They were the smartest and most skilled people in all of Egypt. Some taught him to read and write hieroglyphs, the sacred picture writing of the Egyptians. Others taught him mathematics, so he could understand how to build temples and manage the wealth of the kingdom. This was not a game or a training exercise. These were real soldiers bleeding and dying to protect the Egyptian empire. The boy realized that being pharaoh meant being responsible for the lives of thousands of warriors who would follow his orders into deadly situations. Unlike children today who go to school with many other students, Ramesses learned from private tutors who taught only him. These were not ordinary teachers. The young prince learned that being pharaoh was much more complicated than just sitting on a throne and giving orders. When Ramesses was still a small child, his father made a decision that shocked everyone in the palace. This was not just a fancy name to make the young prince feel important. The other soldiers were amazed to see such a young boy training alongside them. By the time Ramesses turned 14, his father decided the boy was ready for something even more challenging. The first time young Ramesses saw men die in battle, it changed him forever. But war also taught Ramesses important lessons he could not have learned in the palace. During these military campaigns, Ramesses also met people from the edges of the Egyptian empire. He saw how different tribes and kingdoms lived. He learned their languages and customs. The young prince was not just learning to be a soldier. Egyptian religion was not simple. There were dozens of different gods, each with their own powers and personalities. Architecture and building were also crucial parts of his education. Perhaps most importantly, the future pharaoh learned about leadership itself. As Ramesses grew from a boy into a young man, everyone around him could see that he was becoming something special. By the time Ramesses reached his early 20s, he had received an education that no school today could match. When his father Seti I died in 1279 before Christ, Ramesses was as prepared as any person could be for the enormous challenge ahead. The death of a pharaoh in ancient Egypt was always a dangerous time. When the news spread that Seti I had died, whispers began throughout the empire. Would the new pharaoh be strong enough to hold the kingdom together? Would enemies see this as their chance to attack? Would the gods accept the new ruler? All those years of military training, all those lessons about religion and politics, all those experiences traveling with the army had prepared him for this single moment. He was no longer a prince learning to be a leader. He was now the pharaoh of Egypt, the most powerful man in the known world. For 24-year-old Ramesses, these whispers were not just gossip. They were matters of life and death. He had to show the people, the nobles, the priests, and the army that he was worthy to be their new pharaoh. Any sign of weakness could lead to rebellion or invasion. Enemy kingdoms were watching Egypt carefully, waiting to see if the young new ruler could maintain the strength that had made Egypt great. Ramesses knew that this would be his chance to announce to Egypt and the world that a new era had begun. Every detail was carefully planned to create maximum impact. The ceremony would take place at the great temple complex in Thebes, the religious heart of the Egyptian empire. A pharaoh who looked weak would soon become weak in truth. There were Egyptian nobles in their finest clothes, Foreign ambassadors from distant kingdoms, priests in their sacred robes, and military officers in their best armor. The air was thick with incense and excitement as everyone waited to see their new pharaoh receive the blessing of the gods. This crown was not just a symbol of royal power. According to Egyptian religious beliefs, it actually transformed the person wearing it into a god on earth. The moment the crown touched his head, Ramesses became Horus, the falcon god of kingship. He was no longer merely human. As the first rays of sunlight touched the temple walls, Ramesses walked slowly toward the altar where the high priest waited. He was dressed in simple white cloth, symbolizing his rebirth as a divine ruler. He was now responsible for the welfare of millions of people scattered across an empire that stretched from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north. Instead of keeping all the same advisors his father had used, Ramesses carefully selected a new group of officials. He chose people based on their ability and loyalty rather than their family connections. They showed his respect for the gods and the priests who served them. He allowed people in different parts of the kingdom to see their new ruler in person. He ordered repairs and improvements to existing temples, while also beginning to plan entirely new construction projects. These building programs served multiple purposes. They provided jobs for thousands of workers, they honored the gods, and they created permanent monuments to his reign. And they demonstrated that Ramesses intended to be an active pharaoh, who would travel throughout his empire rather than staying hidden in his palace. This sent a clear message that under the new pharaoh, only the most capable individuals would hold positions of power. Every decision he made could mean the difference between prosperity and disaster, between peace and war, between life and death for countless individuals. There were no rebellions, no invasions, and no challenges to his rule. The transition from father to son had been smooth and complete. Soon he would face military challenges that would threaten the very existence of Egypt. He would need to prove that all his training and preparation had made him worthy of the throne his father had left him. The young man who had once been a student learning about leadership was now the undisputed master of the ancient world's greatest empire. He understood that being pharaoh required more than just making good decisions. It required inspiring millions of people to believe in his divine authority. Every speech he gave, every ceremony he attended, every decree he issued was designed to reinforce the image of a ruler blessed by the gods themselves. With each step, he moved closer to becoming not just a man, but a living god. Instead of waiting for enemies to test his strength, Ramesses decided to demonstrate Egyptian power through carefully planned military exercises. He assembled large armies and conducted training maneuvers near the borders of the empire. Foreign spies who witnessed these displays reported back to their kings that the new pharaoh commanded forces just as powerful as his father had. Therefore, he made sure that every public appearance during the mourning period sent a clear message. He walked with the confidence of a man born to rule. He spoke with the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. He dressed in the finest royal clothes to show the wealth and power of Egypt. Instead, he seemed to grow stronger and more confident with each passing hour. Those who watched him during his first days as pharaoh reported that he moved and spoke like someone who had been born for this role. There was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty in his actions. The moment his father breathed his last breath, Ramesses knew that everything he had learned during his long education would now be tested. But becoming pharaoh was not as simple as putting on a crown. First, there had to be a proper funeral for his father. In ancient Egypt, the death of a pharaoh required 70 days of religious ceremonies. The royal body had to be carefully prepared for the afterlife, through a complex process called mummification. Meanwhile, the entire kingdom went into mourning, and government business nearly stopped. During these 70 days, Ramesses faced his first real test as a leader. Ramesses understood that in the ancient world, appearance was almost as important as reality. The coronation ceremony itself was planned to be the most magnificent event anyone had ever seen. On the day of his coronation, thousands of people gathered to witness history. The ceremony began at sunrise with prayers to Ra, the sun god, who was considered the father of all pharaohs. The high priest placed the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt on Ramesses' head. As the crowd cheered and priests chanted sacred prayers, Ramesses felt the full weight of his new responsibilities. But Ramesses was not overwhelmed by this enormous responsibility. One of his first decisions as pharaoh showed his political wisdom. Ramesses also made sure to visit the most important temples throughout Egypt during his first months as pharaoh. These visits served several purposes. During these early temple visits, Ramesses began to develop the building program that would eventually make him famous. The young pharaoh also quickly showed his military leadership abilities. Perhaps most importantly, Ramesses began to develop the confident, larger-than-life personality that would define his entire reign. Within just a few months of becoming pharaoh, Ramesses had successfully established his authority throughout the empire. But Ramesses knew that maintaining power would be much more difficult than gaining it. The real tests of his leadership still lay ahead. 5 years had passed since Ramesses became pharaoh of Egypt. He had proven himself to be a strong ruler who commanded respect throughout his empire. But in 1274 before Christ, he would face the greatest test of his entire life, a test that would either destroy him or make him a legend forever. This test would come at a place called Kadesh, a fortress city that sat like a jewel on the trade routes between Egypt and the lands of the north. The trouble began with Egypt's greatest enemy, the Hittite Empire. For many years, these two mighty kingdoms had fought for control of the lands we now call Syria and Lebanon. These territories were incredibly valuable because all the trade between Asia and Africa had to pass through them. They were not desert tribes with simple weapons and small armies. The Hittite Empire was as advanced and powerful as Egypt itself. The sight of this great army marching north was magnificent and terrifying. The ground shook under the feet of 20,000 marching men. They wore armor that had been blessed by the priests and carried weapons that had been forged by the best craftsmen in Egypt. But more than his equipment, it was his confidence that impressed everyone who saw him. He looked like a man who had never lost a battle and never expected to lose one. The air filled with dust from hundreds of war chariots. Enemy scouts who saw this force racing toward them fled in panic to warn their commanders. Bedouin scouts reported that the main Hittite army was still far away, at least 2 days' march from the fortress city. This meant that Ramesses could capture Kadesh before the Hittites could come to defend it. Victory seemed certain and easy. If he allowed the Hittites to capture more Egyptian lands without fighting back, other enemies would think Egypt had become weak. The city appeared to be lightly defended, exactly as the false scouts had reported. The young pharaoh began planning how he would accept the surrender of the garrison and how he would celebrate this easy victory. It was the rumble of thousands of war chariots charging at full speed. The trap that King Muwatalli had so carefully prepared was finally being sprung, and Ramesses was right in the center of it. In his mind, he was already composing the messages he would send back to Egypt, announcing his triumph. Soldiers who had never known defeat suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against impossible odds. Some tried to run, but the fast Hittite chariots caught them easily. Others formed small groups and fought desperately, but they were quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers. These were not the light chariots that Egypt used for speed and mobility. His bodyguards were falling around him. His horses were wounded and frightened. Enemy warriors were closing in from every direction, their weapons aimed at the golden pharaoh who had walked so confidently into their trap. These were heavy Hittite war chariots, each carrying 3 warriors instead of 2. Each pulled by larger and stronger horses than the Egyptians had ever seen. They crashed into the Egyptian ranks like an avalanche of wood, metal, and flesh. Soon rebellions would break out across the empire and everything his father had built would crumble into dust. They were spies sent by the clever Hittite king to trick the young pharaoh. The information they gave was completely false. In reality, 50,000 Hittite warriors were hiding just beyond the hills near Kadesh, waiting like a pack of hungry wolves for the perfect moment to strike. The young pharaoh who had dreamed of eternal fame was about to become just another casualty of ancient warfare. But in this moment of ultimate crisis, something extraordinary happened. Instead of giving in to fear or despair, Ramesses discovered within himself a strength and courage that would become legendary. He assembled the largest army Egypt had fielded in decades. 20,000 of the finest soldiers in the world gathered under the pharaoh's banners. They were organized into 4 great divisions, each named after one of Egypt's most important gods. There was the division of Amun, the king of the gods. There was the division of Ra, the sun god. There was the division of Ptah, the god of craftsmen. And there was the division of Seth, the god of war and chaos. instead of keeping his 4 divisions together. He decided to rush ahead with just his personal guard and the division of Amun. He wanted to reach Kadesh first and claim the glory of capturing the city for himself. The other 3 divisions were ordered to follow behind at their normal marching pace. They had skilled metalworkers who made the finest weapons in the world. They had thousands of war chariots pulled by the fastest horses. Most dangerous of all, they had a king named Muwatalli II, who was as clever and ambitious as Ramesses himself. Whoever controlled these lands would become rich from the taxes they could collect from merchants and traders. The Hittites were not like the other enemies Egypt had faced before. When reports reached the Egyptian court that Hittite armies were moving south toward Egyptian territory, Ramesses knew he had to act quickly. Ramesses began preparing for war with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. Each division was a complete army in itself, with infantry soldiers carrying spears and shields, archers with powerful bows, and chariot crews with the fastest horses in Egypt. Ramesses himself rode at the head of his army in a golden war chariot, pulled by his finest horses. As the Egyptian army approached Kadesh, Ramesses received information that filled him with excitement. What Ramesses did not know was that these Bedouin scouts were not working for Egypt. Confident that victory was within his grasp, Ramesses made a decision that nearly cost him everything. As Ramesses and his advance force approached the walls of Kadesh, everything seemed peaceful and quiet. Then disaster struck with the speed of lightning. From behind the hills around Kadesh came a sound like thunder, but it was not a storm approaching. Within minutes, the small Egyptian force found itself completely surrounded by Hittite chariots. The division of Ammon, which had seemed so powerful just moments before, began to fall apart under the massive Hittite assault. In the chaos and confusion of the battle, Ramesses found himself in the most dangerous situation of his entire life. For a few terrible moments, it seemed certain that the reign of Ramesses the Great would end before it had truly begun. After the great battle at Kadesh, Ramesses returned to Egypt as a hero. The stories of his brave fight against impossible odds spread throughout the kingdom like wildfire. But the young pharaoh understood something that many rulers before him had missed. Military victories alone do not make a pharaoh immortal. Battles are won and lost, but buildings can last forever. If he truly wanted his name to echo through eternity, he needed to create monuments so magnificent that future generations would never forget them. He visited the ancient pyramids at Giza, marveling at their perfect geometric shapes and massive size. He explored the great temple complexes at Karnak and Luxor, studying how the builders had arranged columns and halls to create spaces that felt both human and divine. He wanted to create something entirely new, something so impressive that it would make all previous monuments seem small by comparison. He began planning construction projects on a scale that no pharaoh had ever attempted. Where earlier rulers had built single temples, Ramesses would build entire temple cities. Where they had erected individual statues, he would create forests of stone images. Ramesses wanted to carve an entire temple directly into the living rock of a cliff face. This had never been attempted on such a large scale before. He recruited workers from across the empire, promising good pay and the honor of creating something that would last forever. Supplies had to be transported hundreds of miles up the Nile River to the remote construction site. The work would require thousands of skilled craftsmen working for many years in the harsh heat of the southern desert. The costs would be enormous, and the technical challenges seemed overwhelming. They used copper and bronze tools to chip away tiny pieces of rock, gradually revealing the human figures hidden within the stone. A single mistake could ruin months of work, so every chisel stroke had to be planned and executed with absolute precision. The builders had to make sure that the temple would remain structurally sound, despite being carved from solid rock. They had to design drainage systems to prevent water damage during the annual Nile floods. Most remarkably, they positioned the entire temple so that twice each year, on the pharaoh's birthday and coronation day, the rising sun would shine through the temple entrance and illuminate statues of the gods in the innermost chamber. He examined statues and reliefs, learning how artists could carve stone to tell stories that would last for thousands of years. Ramesses had always been interested in building and construction. Even as a child, he had watched with fascination as workers built temples and palaces. Throughout Egypt and Nubia, work began on dozens of other temples, palaces, and monuments. At Karnak, he added a magnificent hypostyle hall filled with forest of columns, each one as thick as a giant tree trunk and covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions praising his reign. The old capital at Thebes was ancient and prestigious, but Ramesses wanted something that would reflect his own vision and personality. He chose a site in the Nile Delta and began construction of Ramesses, a city designed to showcase Egyptian power to foreign visitors and merchants. He believed that magnificent monuments brought honor to Egypt and to the gods. They provided employment for thousands of people. They demonstrated Egyptian wealth and power to potential enemies. Visitors came from across the known world to marvel at his temples and statues. The fame of his monuments spread far beyond Egypt's borders, making his name known in distant lands that Egyptian armies had never reached. Most importantly, they would preserve his memory and achievements for all future generations. At Memphis, he erected enormous statues that dominated the city's skyline. He had learned mathematics and engineering from the best teachers in Egypt. Stone had to be quarried from distant mountains and transported by boat down the Nile River. Precious metals and jewels had to be imported from foreign lands. Thousands of workers needed to be fed, housed, and paid. The scale of construction was so vast that it employed a significant portion of Egypt's entire population. These would be the largest statues ever carved, visible from miles away across the desert. Each statue would show the pharaoh in a different pose and with different symbols of royal power. But all would have the same message. Here sits a king who is equal to the gods themselves. Wide boulevards lined with palm trees connected magnificent palaces and temples. Gardens filled with exotic plants and flowers provided cool shade during the hot summer months. Artificial lakes reflected the light from golden statues and colorful buildings. The royal palace at the center of the city was so splendid that foreign ambassadors reported they had never seen anything like it. Now, as pharaoh with unlimited resources at his command, he could turn his grandest dreams into solid stone reality. This was not simply a hollow cave, but a carefully designed series of halls and chambers, each one decorated with intricate reliefs and paintings. The walls told the story of Ramesses' greatest victories, especially his heroic fight at the Battle of Kadesh. Visitors walking through the temple would see the pharaoh defeating his enemies, receiving tribute from foreign lands, and performing religious ceremonies with the gods themselves. The first thing Ramesses did was to study all the great buildings that earlier pharaohs had created. He chose a location in Nubia, far south of the traditional Egyptian heartland, at a place called Abu Simbel. This site sat on the banks of the Nile River, where the water curved in such a way that the rising sun would shine directly on the temple entrance every morning. But Ramesses was not content to simply copy what had been done before. The centerpiece of his building program would be a temple complex unlike anything the world had ever seen. The project at Abu Simbel was so ambitious that many of his advisors thought it was impossible. But Ramesses was determined to make his vision real. He assembled teams of the finest architects, engineers, sculptors, and painters in Egypt. The most spectacular feature of the great temple at Abu Simbel would be for colossal seated statues of Ramesses himself, each one standing 65 feet tall. Creating these enormous statues required incredible skill and patience. The sculptors had to work from detailed drawings and measurements to ensure that each statue was perfectly proportioned. But the statues were only the beginning. Behind them, teams of workers carved deep into the cliff to create the temple interior. The engineering challenges of Abu Simbel were as impressive as the artistic ones. While Abu Simbel was the crown jewel of his building program, it was far from Ramesses' only construction project. Perhaps most impressive was his decision to build an entirely new capital city. Ramesses was planned as the most beautiful city in the world. All of these construction projects required enormous amounts of money, materials, and labor. Critics, both ancient and modern, have argued that Ramesses' building program was wastefully expensive and served mainly to satisfy his personal vanity. But the pharaoh himself saw these projects differently. The years passed and his great buildings rose toward completion. Ramesses could see that his strategy was working. For 15 years after the great battle at Kadesh, Egypt and the Hittite Empire remained locked in a deadly struggle. Neither kingdom could completely defeat the other, but both kept fighting expensive wars that drained their treasuries and cost thousands of lives. Cities changed hands multiple times as armies marched back and forth across the disputed territories. He would need to find a way to end this destructive cycle of warfare without appearing weak to his own people or to his enemies. This would require not the strength of a soldier or the vision of an architect, but the wisdom of a diplomat and the patience of a chess player, thinking many moves ahead. Young men died in battles far from home, while their families waited for news that might never come. Ramesses had proven himself to be a great warrior and a brilliant builder, but now he would face a challenge that required different skills entirely. New groups of warriors called the Sea Peoples were raiding coastal cities throughout the Mediterranean. These businessmen were tired of having their profitable trade routes disrupted by constant warfare. They quietly suggested to both rulers that there might be ways to end the fighting, while allowing both kings to maintain their dignity and reputation. In the ancient world, any pharaoh who appeared to be seeking peace from a position of weakness would quickly face rebellions from his own nobles and attacks from foreign enemies. The negotiations would have to be handled in such a way that both sides could claim victory. Syrian armies were growing stronger in the east. Desert tribes were becoming bolder in their attacks on Egyptian settlements. If Egypt continued to spend all its energy fighting the Hittites, these other threats might soon become unstoppable. This was incredibly dangerous work that required absolute trust and discretion. Diplomats had to travel through hostile territory carrying messages that could start or end wars. Any lasting peace treaty would need to address territorial boundaries, trade relationships, mutual defense agreements, and procedures for handling future disputes. Both sides had to be convinced that the agreement would actually be honored rather than broken as soon as it became convenient to do so. But even this agreement was only the beginning of an even more challenging process. The actual treaty would need to be written in a way that satisfied the legal traditions and religious beliefs of both civilizations. Previous agreements between kingdoms had usually been temporary truces or surrender documents imposed by the winner on the loser. This was something entirely different, a comprehensive peace agreement between equals that was designed to last forever. It created mutual defense obligations, meaning that if either empire was attacked by a third party, the other would come to its aid. It included provisions for extraditing criminals and political refugees who fled from one kingdom to the other. Most importantly, it established formal procedures for resolving future disputes through negotiation rather than warfare. Every word would be scrutinized by scholars, priests, and military leaders looking for hidden meanings or potential problems. Each side tested the other's sincerity while trying to determine what concessions might be possible. The wedding celebration was designed to show both the Egyptian and Hittite people that this was not a marriage of conquest or submission, but a union between equals. The princess was given an Egyptian name and treated with all the honor due to a pharaoh's wife. They had created the world's first comprehensive international agreement, establishing principles that would influence diplomacy for thousands of years to come. More immediately, the end of the costly war with the Hittites freed enormous resources that both empires could use for peaceful purposes. Her arrival marked the beginning of a new era in which the two great empires would be partners rather than enemies. Ramesses had to balance his desire for peace with the expectations of his generals, priests, and nobles, many of whom had built their careers and reputations on the war with the Hittites. The Hittite king would send one of his daughters to Egypt to become one of Ramesses' wives. This was not unusual in itself, as royal marriages had long been used to cement political alliances. He was no longer just a great warrior and builder. He had also proven himself to be a diplomatic genius, capable of achieving through negotiation what years of warfare had failed to accomplish. What made this marriage special was the enormous ceremony and celebration that surrounded it. Copies were made and distributed throughout both empires, so that everyone would know the conditions of the peace. The treaty was also deposited in the most sacred temples of both kingdoms, symbolically placing it under the protection of the gods themselves. A single mistake or betrayal could result not only in the failure of peace efforts, but also in the torture and execution of everyone involved in the negotiations. The pharaoh began to realize that continuous warfare was actually making Egypt weaker, not stronger. Every year spent fighting the Hittites was a year when Egyptian resources could not be used for building temples, developing trade, or improving the lives of the people. Meanwhile, other enemies were watching and waiting for both empires to exhaust themselves so they could attack. When Egypt and the Hittites were too weak to defend themselves. Reports from across the ancient world confirmed Ramesses' growing concerns. At the same time, Ramesses learned that the Hittite king was facing similar problems. Hattusili III, who had taken power from his nephew in a palace coup, was dealing with rebellions in his own empire and threats from kingdoms to the north and east.
Ow.
Neither Pharaoh nor king could afford to keep fighting forever, but both were too proud to be the first to suggest peace. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Merchants and traders who traveled between the two empires began to carry unofficial messages back and forth. Ramesses was intrigued by these possibilities, but he knew he had to proceed very carefully. The first step was to establish secret communication channels between the two royal courts. For months, carefully worded messages traveled back and forth between Egypt and the Hittite capital. The discussions were incredibly complex, because they involved much more than simply agreeing to stop fighting. After nearly 2 years of secret negotiations, both rulers agreed that a formal peace treaty was possible. The final treaty that emerged from these negotiations was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. The treaty established clear borders between Egyptian and Hittite territories, with both sides agreeing to respect the other's sovereignty. Both versions of the treaty, written in Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform script, contained identical terms and were signed by both rulers. To seal this historic agreement and ensure that future generations would honor it, Ramesses and Hattusili arranged something even more remarkable: a royal marriage alliance. When the Hittite princess arrived in Egypt, she was greeted with festivities that lasted for weeks. The peace treaty between Ramesses and Hattusili was revolutionary in ways that neither ruler could have fully understood at the time. For Ramesses personally, the successful negotiation of this treaty added a new dimension to his reputation. Being pharaoh of the greatest empire in the ancient world might have seemed like the most wonderful life imaginable. But Ramesses faced challenges that would have broken many lesser men. The sheer length of his reign, which lasted 66 years, meant that problems kept appearing like waves crashing against the shore. Just when one crisis was solved, another would emerge to test his wisdom, strength, and determination. The first great challenge came from the kingdom of Nubia in the far south of Egypt. This land was incredibly valuable to Egypt because it contained some of the richest gold mines in the ancient world. Egyptian gold was famous throughout the known world and provided much of the wealth that paid for the pharaoh's armies, buildings, and luxurious court life. They lived in a harsh desert environment that made them tough and resourceful. Egyptian soldiers had to march for weeks through desert landscapes where temperatures could reach deadly levels during the day and drop to freezing at night. Many never returned home, dying not in glorious battles but from heat stroke, dehydration, and tropical diseases that Egyptian doctors did not know how to treat. The Sea Peoples, mysterious warriors who came from somewhere in the Mediterranean, began launching increasingly bold attacks on Egypt's coastal cities and trading ships. These raiders were unlike any enemy Egypt had faced before. They did not want to conquer territory or establish kingdoms. They seemed interested only in destruction and plunder. Each campaign cost enormous amounts of money and took years to organize and execute. Unlike the settled farmers of Egypt who lived peacefully along the Nile River, the Nubians were nomadic tribes who could appear and disappear into the desert like ghosts. The massive building projects that made him famous required enormous amounts of money, materials, and labor. Stone had to be quarried from distant mountains and transported hundreds of miles by boat and cart. Skilled craftsmen demanded high wages for their specialized work. The sheer scale of construction sometimes strained Egypt's economy to the breaking point. Without the annual flood to water their fields, farmers could not grow enough grain to feed the population. Food prices would soar, and hungry people would begin to question whether their pharaoh still enjoyed the favor of the gods. They would attack fishing villages, burn trading posts, and capture merchant ships before disappearing back into the open sea. Egyptian armies, which were designed to fight land battles in desert terrain, struggled to deal with enemies who could attack from the water and escape before reinforcements arrived. She had been his partner, not just in marriage, but in ruling the empire. Her intelligence, beauty, and diplomatic skills had made her invaluable in managing relationships with foreign rulers and Egyptian nobles. When she died relatively young, Ramesses was left not only heartbroken, but also without one of his most trusted advisors. As a man who lived well into his 90s, in an age when most people died young, he was forced to watch many of his children die before him. He had over 100 children with his various wives and concubines, but being Pharaoh's son or daughter did not protect them from disease, accidents, or the simple fact that life was dangerous and uncertain in the ancient world. The rise of new powers in Mesopotamia and the eastern Mediterranean meant that Egypt could no longer dominate international relations as it had for centuries. Younger, more aggressive kingdoms were challenging Egypt's position as the supreme power in the ancient world. Merchants became afraid to send valuable cargo on ships that might be captured by pirates. Instead of hiding problems from his people or pretending that everything was perfect, he often turned challenges into opportunities to demonstrate his leadership abilities. Military campaigns became chances to show his personal courage. Economic difficulties became opportunities to display his administrative skills. Even personal tragedies were transformed into public demonstrations of royal strength and dignity. Foreign traders stopped visiting Egyptian ports, reducing the taxes and tribute that helped fund the pharaoh's government. Each crisis was met with the same energy and intelligence that he had shown as a young pharaoh facing his first battle. Whether dealing with rebellious Nubians, mysterious sea raiders, economic problems, or family tragedies, he approached every challenge as a test of his fitness to rule. With so many sons from different mothers, the royal family was filled with rivalries and tensions. Each prince had supporters among the nobles and priests, who hoped to gain power when the current pharaoh died. Ramesses had to carefully balance these competing factions while trying to choose the best successor from among his surviving sons. The economic damage from these attacks was often worse than the immediate physical destruction they caused. Climate changes affected weather patterns throughout the Mediterranean region, sometimes causing droughts that reduced crop yields and created food shortages. New technologies, particularly iron weapons, were beginning to give Egypt's enemies advantages that the Pharaoh's bronze-equipped armies could not easily match. Thousands of soldiers had to be fed, equipped, and paid. Government officials throughout the empire needed salaries to prevent corruption and rebellion. Religious ceremonies and festivals, which were essential for maintaining public support, required expensive offerings and decorations. When Egyptian armies marched south to punish rebellious tribes, they often found empty camps and abandoned villages. But controlling Nubia was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The Nubian people were fierce warriors who had never willingly accepted Egyptian rule. Every few years, news would arrive in the Egyptian capital that another Nubian uprising had begun. Local chieftains would unite their tribes and attack Egyptian mining settlements, killing workers and soldiers while carrying off gold and supplies. These rebellions meant that Ramesses had to send armies hundreds of miles south into territory where the heat was unbearable. Water was scarce, and disease killed more soldiers than enemy weapons did. The campaigns in Nubia were brutal and expensive. But Nubia was not Ramesses' only source of trouble. The Sea Peoples traveled in large fleets of ships and could strike anywhere along Egypt's long coastline without warning. These raids disrupted Egypt's profitable trade with other Mediterranean civilizations. Economic problems created additional challenges for Ramesses throughout his long reign. At the same time, maintaining Egypt's large army and extensive government bureaucracy required constant funding. When the Nile River failed to flood properly, which happened several times during Ramesses' reign, the resulting famines created terrible hardships for ordinary Egyptians. Personal tragedies also struck Ramesses repeatedly throughout his extraordinarily long life. The death of his beloved wife Nefertari was perhaps the most devastating personal blow Ramesses ever suffered. The problem of succession created ongoing stress throughout Ramesses' later years. As Ramesses grew older, he also had to face the reality that even his mighty empire was not invincible. Perhaps most troubling of all was the gradual realization that the world was changing in ways that made traditional Egyptian methods of warfare and diplomacy less effective. Despite all these challenges, Ramesses never allowed adversity to break his spirit or weaken his determination. The way Ramesses handled these difficulties became part of his legend. By the time Ramesses reached his 70s, he had already ruled Egypt longer than most pharaohs had lived. Had seen empires rise and fall, watched entire generations of people be born, grow old, and die. For many Egyptians, he was the only pharaoh they had ever known. Young soldiers served under a king who had been fighting battles since before their grandfathers were born. To them, Ramesses seemed less like a mortal man and more like one of the eternal gods who had always existed and always would. But Ramesses himself knew that he was still human, despite what his subjects might believe. His body showed the effects of decades of warfare, long journeys across the empire, and the constant stress of ruling the ancient world's greatest kingdom. His hair had turned completely white, and his face bore the lines and scars of a man who had lived through more adventures and challenges than most people could imagine. If anything, the approaching end of his life made him more determined than ever to ensure that his achievements would survive long after he was gone. The Battle of Kadesh was described in detail on temple walls from the Mediterranean coast to the borders of Nubia. His peace treaty with the Hittites was carved into stone so that future diplomats could study its terms and methods. His building projects were documented with precise measurements and techniques so that later architects could learn from his innovations. He had spent 60 years building monuments and creating legends. But now he faced his greatest challenge, making sure that future generations would remember and honor everything he had accomplished. Even in his advanced age, he continued to plan and oversee new construction projects. His energy amazed everyone around him. While other elderly people spent their days resting in comfortable chairs, the aged pharaoh could still be found climbing scaffolding to inspect temple decorations or riding his chariot to visit construction sites hundreds of miles from the capital. This burial chamber was designed to be the most elaborate and magnificent tomb ever created for any pharaoh. Every wall was covered with religious texts and magical spells designed to help him successfully journey to the afterlife. The burial chamber itself was filled with treasures that would provide for his needs in the world of the dead. But Ramesses did not simply name his successor and step aside. Instead, he spent several years working closely with Maranta, teaching him the secrets of successful rulership that could not be learned from books or advisors. He ordered the construction of new irrigation canals to bring water to previously barren lands. He established schools where young Egyptians could learn to read and write. He created funds to support widows and orphans who had lost family members in military service. Ramesses introduced Maranta to foreign ambassadors and showed him how to conduct diplomatic negotiations. He explained the complex relationships between different noble families and religious groups that any pharaoh needed to understand to maintain political stability. He met with high priests to ensure that religious ceremonies would continue to be performed correctly. He reviewed military plans with his generals and discussed diplomatic strategies with his ambassadors. He had successfully passed a stable, wealthy, and peaceful kingdom to his chosen successor. His building projects had created employment for thousands of people and monuments that would inspire awe for millennia. He had successfully prepared for his own immortality, creating a legacy so carefully planned and thoroughly documented that his name and achievements would never be forgotten. His diplomatic innovations had established lasting peace with former enemies. Yet age had not weakened his mind or diminished his ambition. He wanted his people to see the incredible wealth and artistic skill that went into preparing for his death. Ramesses genuinely believed that a pharaoh's first responsibility was to ensure the happiness and security of his subjects. He had spent his entire adult life working to build an empire that would provide peace and prosperity for generations of Egyptians. This served several purposes. It demonstrated that he was confident of divine favor and had no fear of death. It provided work for hundreds of artists and craftsmen. Most importantly, it reminded everyone that even after death, Ramesses would continue to be a powerful force watching over Egypt. The pharaoh began what he called his final campaign, but this was not a war fought with armies and weapons. His body, which had survived countless battles and journeys, was finally beginning to fail. He could no longer ride his war chariot at full speed or climb the steep stairs of his tallest monuments. But his mind remained sharp, and his determination to prepare Egypt for the future never wavered. It was a battle against time itself and the human tendency to forget the past. He understood that even the most magnificent buildings could crumble if they were not properly maintained. These were not simple lists of dates and facts, but carefully written stories that explained not just what had happened, but why it had happened, and what lessons future rulers could learn from his experiences. With so many sons to choose from, this was not an easy decision. He needed someone who had the intelligence to handle complex political situations, the strength to command respect from the army, and the wisdom to maintain the peace and prosperity that Egypt enjoyed. He wanted his successors to understand the reasoning behind his decisions, so they could apply the same wisdom to the problems they would face. Even the most glorious victories could be forgotten if they were not constantly retold. Even the wisest laws and treaties could be ignored if people did not understand why they had been created. Ramesses ordered his scribes to create detailed records of every important event from his reign. The walls of temples throughout Egypt were covered with new inscriptions that told the story of Ramesses' greatest achievements. But Ramesses was not content to simply record his past accomplishments. One of his most ambitious final projects was the completion of his own tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Unlike earlier pharaohs who kept their tomb preparations secret, Ramesses made his burial arrangements a public spectacle. The pharaoh also spent considerable time and effort selecting and training his successor. His choice eventually fell on his 13th son Maranta, who had proven himself to be a capable military commander and administrator. Together, father and son traveled throughout the empire, visiting important cities and meeting with local governors. During these final years, Ramesses also focused on ensuring the continued prosperity of his people. The pharaoh's concern for his people's welfare was not just political calculation, though it certainly helped maintain public support for his government. As his 90th birthday approached, Ramesses knew that his time was running short. He spent his final months giving detailed instructions to government officials about how various departments should be managed after his death. When death finally came to Ramesses in 1213 before Christ, after 66 years on the throne, Egypt was stronger and more prosperous than it had ever been before. But perhaps most importantly, Ramesses had achieved something that very few people in history have accomplished. More than 3,000 years have passed since Ramesses the Great drew his last breath, yet his name remains more famous than most people who are alive today. Walk into any museum in the world, and you will likely find statues, artifacts, or displays dedicated to this remarkable pharaoh. Ask any schoolchild to name an ancient Egyptian ruler, and they will probably say Ramesses. The methods he developed for projecting royal power, conducting diplomacy, and creating lasting monuments became the standard that all future rulers would try to match. Egyptian pharaohs who came after him studied his inscriptions and tried to copy his techniques. Foreign kings sent ambassadors to Egypt, specifically to see the temples and statues he had built. Roman emperors studied Egyptian methods of royal propaganda and tried to create similar monuments to their own greatness. They preserved detailed descriptions of his temples and recorded the hieroglyphic inscriptions that covered their walls. These medieval accounts helped keep the memory of the great pharaoh alive during centuries when most Europeans had never heard his name. Here was the preserved body of one of history's most famous rulers, a man who had lived over 3,000 years ago, yet whose face could still be seen by modern people. The mummy was transported to Cairo and put on display, where it continues to draw crowds of visitors from around the globe. The international community decided that these monuments were too valuable to lose. People from dozens of different nations contributed money and expertise to save his monuments, because they recognized that these buildings belong not just to Egypt, but to all humanity. He has been the subject of countless books, documentaries, and movies. His name and image appear on everything from tourist souvenirs to luxury hotels. Video games and computer animations allow people to explore virtual recreations of his temples and experience what it might have been like to live in his empire. A copy of this ancient agreement hangs in the United Nations headquarters in New York as a reminder that even the oldest civilizations understood the importance of international cooperation and peaceful conflict resolution. Studies of his mummy have provided valuable information about health, nutrition, and medical practices in ancient times. He created a legacy that has not only survived but has actually grown stronger with the passage of time. Instead of being forgotten like most ancient rulers, he has become more famous and more widely known than he was during his own lifetime. Analysis of his teeth and bones has revealed details about his diet and lifestyle that help us understand how people lived over 3,000 years ago. He has become the eternal pharaoh, the ultimate symbol of royal power and achievement. His story continues to inspire and fascinate new generations of people who discover in his life proof that human ambition and determination can indeed create something that lasts forever. Diplomats and negotiators still study the treaty's terms and methods for insights into successful peacemaking. The pharaoh, who once ruled only the Nile Valley, had somehow become a figure of global importance. Business schools analyze his methods of managing large projects and motivating workers. Historians point out that his massive building programs sometimes strained Egypt's economy, and that his long reign created succession problems that weakened the empire after his death. These observations remind us that even the greatest leaders are human, and that success in one area does not guarantee success in all areas. Military academies examine his strategies and tactics. Political scientists study his diplomatic innovations and their influence on international relations. In one of the most ambitious archaeological projects ever attempted, the entire temple complex was carefully cut into blocks, moved to higher ground, and reassembled exactly as Ramesses had originally built it. The influence of Ramesses' building program can be seen in Roman architecture throughout their vast empire. Excavations throughout Egypt and Sudan continued to uncover temples, statues, and inscriptions that he commissioned. Advanced techniques like computer analysis and satellite imaging have shown that his building program was even more extensive than historians previously realized. Some of his monuments that had been buried by sand for centuries are now being carefully uncovered and restored. His dream of achieving immortality through fame has succeeded beyond even his wildest imagination. When Ramesses died in 1213 before Christ, his immediate impact on Egypt was already clear. When Napoleon's army invaded Egypt in 1798, he brought with them scholars who were amazed by the pharaoh's monuments. Their detailed drawings and descriptions introduced Ramesses to a European audience that was fascinated by the grandeur and mystery of ancient Egyptian civilization. He left behind an empire that was wealthier, more powerful, and more respected than it had ever been before. His peace treaty with the Hittites had ended decades of costly warfare and created an era of prosperity that allowed both civilizations to flourish. His magnificent buildings employed thousands of workers and created monuments that drew visitors from across the known world. But the true measure of Ramesses' greatness would only become apparent as the centuries passed. The influence of Ramesses spread far beyond Egypt's borders through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Merchants who visited his great cities carried stories of Egyptian wealth and power back to their homelands. Foreign princes who were educated in Egyptian schools learned to admire the pharaoh's achievements and tried to imitate them in their own kingdoms. Even Egypt's enemies respected the military and diplomatic skills that had made Ramesses so successful. His architectural legacy proved to be especially enduring. The temples and monuments he built were so well designed and constructed that most of them survived for thousands of years. Abu Simbel, his masterpiece in Nubia, continued to amaze visitors throughout ancient times. When the Greek historian Herodotus visited Egypt 500 years after Ramesses' death, he wrote detailed descriptions of the pharaoh's buildings and called them wonders of the world. The Romans, who conquered Egypt in 30 before Christ, were so impressed by Ramesses' monuments that they transported several of his obelisks to Rome and erected them in prominent locations throughout their capital city. During the Middle Ages, when much of the ancient world's knowledge was forgotten in Europe, Arab scholars and travelers continued to visit and write about Ramesses' monuments. The rediscovery of ancient Egypt by European explorers in the 18th and 19th centuries brought Ramesses back into world attention in a dramatic way. The discovery of Ramesses' actual mummy in 1881 created worldwide excitement. Modern archaeology has revealed even more evidence of Ramesses' incredible achievements. Perhaps the most dramatic proof of Ramesses' lasting importance came in the 1960s when the construction of the Aswan High Dam threatened to flood Abu Simbel under the waters of Lake Nasser. This massive rescue operation, funded by countries from around the world, showed that Ramesses' legacy extends far beyond Egypt. Modern popular culture has embraced Ramesses with enthusiasm that would have pleased the ancient pharaoh. The fascination with Ramesses extends beyond mere entertainment. Serious scholars continue to study his reign for insights into leadership, diplomacy, and government administration. Even his failures and mistakes have become valuable lessons for modern leaders. The peace treaty that Ramesses negotiated with the Hittites has become particularly relevant in our modern world. Scientists and doctors continue to learn from Ramesses even in death. In achieving his dream of immortality, Ramesses accomplished something that very few human beings have ever managed. Today, when people think of ancient Egypt, they think of Ramesses the Great.